Welcome to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast for farmers and ag professionals by the Iowa Farm Bureau, bringing you the news, experts, and educational insights that matter most. Now, here's your host.
Welcome to our June 9th edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. I'm Andrew Wheeler. Today we talk with Iowa State University's resident expert on farmland values, economist Dr. Rabail Chandio. We also explore Americans' meat purchasing habits with Rick Stein, who's the Vice President of Fresh Foods for the Food Industry Association. Let's start with Dr. Chandio for a discussion about farmland values and the variables impacting those values. Spokesman reporter Bob Bion has the story.
So I thought we'd talk a little bit about land values and the land value survey that we do each year. Would you mind sharing with us a little bit of your background first and what you do here at Iowa State?
I'm Rabail Chandio. I'm an assistant professor and extension economist here at Iowa State. Primarily, I deal with a lot of things related to land markets. Land values is the number one thing that we keep an eye on. I run the land value survey, which is sent out every November, and the report for that comes out every December. So it's an annual check on how land values are doing. Then one more thing that I specifically do every year is run the Soil Management and Land Valuation Conference at Iowa State.
So specific to the ISU Land Value Survey, maybe a little background on the survey and its importance for Iowa's farmers.
So there's a few different ways that survey is used. Primarily, I'll begin with its importance for how you are taxed as a farmer or the landowner. The land value survey is used by the county assessors to figure out what the assessed value for farmland is, and that's how they determine how much tax every landowner owns. So that is a very big use. Other than that, we also like to keep an eye on land values because the way land values are determined is simply figuring out what the potential income for a specific piece of ground is compared to how much you pay for it, compared to how much you make off of it, accounting for the fact that over time the value of money will decrease and we need to discount that. So it's the present value of all the future income that this land will generate. All of that to say that when we are looking at this one figure called land value, we are seeing what the ag economy is doing, how the farm incomes are doing, what all of those other factors like tariffs, government payments, what will they do to farm incomes. So when we put that together, instead of evaluating them separately, we can just look at the direction of land values, land markets, and sort of have a check on the pulse of how ag economy is doing here in Midwest.
Well, on the survey itself, maybe we can get into some of the details a little bit. Can you summarize the key findings from the most recent ISU Land Value Survey released in December? What were the statewide average land values and how did they compare to previous years?
So this year, after 5 consecutive increases, was the first time we saw a decline in land values. Land values fell by 3.1% compared to the previous December, and they stand now at $11,467 per acre. Now, this decline was anticipated for a couple of years. Ever since the COVID peaks began, ever since we started making those record high land value and we witnessed all those sales, everybody realized that the farm economy is tightening, but we didn't really see that in farm incomes or in land values just yet. So this year, it's sort of a sigh of relief because we did not want to have a bubble in the land markets. We did not want values to be separated from the fundamentals. So although it's a decline in land values, and that's not really a great news for anybody, but I am actually glad to see that we are moving the way we should in the land markets given the economy.
So on a regional level, what were the notable differences in land value trends across various regions of Iowa? Which areas experienced the most significant increases or decreases and why?
I'll begin with the crop reporting districts. This year, 8 of the 9 crop reporting districts experienced a decline in land values. The only region where we saw some increases in land values were South Central, and that's primarily likely to be driven by demand for recreational land, demand for hunting grounds. Other than that, the rest of the state saw declines, and the largest declines were witnessed in Northwest, North Central, and West Central. So that part of the state which experienced the highest increases back in 2021, 2022 are the first to experience bigger declines this year as well. And at the crop reporting district level, the highest decline was at 7.4% for West Central. After that, we had North Central at 4.9% lower values compared to last year. And the third one was our Northwest at 4.4% lower land values compared to last year. If we go into different quality classes, the premium land is still high, the value is still quite high, but the declines are primarily driven by the premium high quality farm ground and medium quality farm ground. The lower values are, one, they're noisy anyway. Two, they were not that high to begin with. They're not falling that much in this declining period as well.
So since December, since the survey came out, have there been any significant changes or emerging trends in Iowa farmland values during the last few months? What factors might be contributing to these developments?
There are two main factors. One, everybody knows the tariffs. We'll see what they do. If they're expected to affect farm incomes negatively, that effect will be transferred onto land values as well. But historically, if I think back to the last time tariffs were introduced, we also had considerable farm support. We also had considerable government payments. It came in the form of market facilitation payments the last time around. Since the tariffs are not fully determined this time around, any support that will come for that is also unsure. We don't know what we'll see. But those will be the two biggest things I'll think about when I'm thinking what will happen to land values and the ag economy. Once we know more about those changes, we can make any predictions as to what might happen. Other than that, we are in a period of ag downturn. We are in a period where farm incomes are tightening. So the decline that began this December, generally I would expect that to continue for a year or so, a couple of years before picking back up again. So we would potentially be in that direction. The scale, it may remain the same, it may change a little bit. We had expected interest rates to ease up a little. They are not easing up in 2025 yet. So if that easing up is not coming, then land values will keep falling. So because we have negative pressures both from the income side and then the interest rate side.
So you mentioned tariffs and interest rates. How have other recent economic factors such as commodity prices or policy changes impacted farmland values in the months following the last survey? Maybe specifically input costs, commodity prices, those things.
So commodity prices were cited as the biggest negative influence on land values in this December's survey. And it has pretty much remained the same since then. Our prices are not really increasing. So the commodity prices being lower or commodity prices falling is what's primarily reducing or decreasing farm income. Until that moves in a different direction, we'll probably keep seeing this negative pressure in the land markets remain. The input costs as well. So it's a two-way street. We're tightening in the ag economy from both ends. The commodity prices are lower, they're not rising, and the input costs are higher, they're not easing up either. So both of those are working together in this economy and giving us lower incomes, lower land values.
So based on the current data and trends, what's your best guess for Iowa farmland values over the next year or two? We talked a little bit about that. Are there indicators suggesting continued growth, stabilization, or probable decline?
Probable decline would be my guess. And that's not only my guess. In our survey, we also ask the respondents to give their predictions for what the land values would be 1 year in the future and 5 years in the future. For 1 year in the future, most respondents did predict a decline. So this year, ag professionals, our respondents include farmers, landowners. They also include farm managers, bankers, ag lenders. So it's a whole lot of professionals active in the land markets. So their collaborative wisdom is also indicating that we're in a period of declining land values, which will continue for at least a year or so. But in the long run, of course, we always expect land values to pick back up again. I can't imagine any period, no matter how far back we go, where land values have not increased in the long run.
Land is always a good investment.
Yes.
Other key factors that landowners, investors, and policymakers monitor that could significantly impact future land values in Iowa?
I guess one more thing that hasn't been talked about as much yet, but I think it might be important for land markets in the future is what happens with renewable energy. I haven't heard a lot of chatter about that, but I have seen different policies at the county level. Some counties promoting renewable energy investments in wind and solar, some counties not allowing that. Whatever ends up happening on that front will be a major change in the land markets. If it's wind, we are already experienced in what that does to land values, how it plays a role, and it's able to coexist with agriculture. We have found a way to integrate that income into the income from the land as well. Right. With solar, it's a little unclear. We don't know what will happen. What will be the scale of application, if any? Will solar become popular in Iowa? Will it not? But either way, that renewable policy landscape would be a big change I would like to keep my eye on and see if it goes through. Specifically, if solar goes through, it'll be an alternative land use. And if we're just thinking about the money, they do offer quite a large sum of money to rent land for solar. So if that alternate use becomes viable, I don't want to predict yet what that will do. What happens on that front, let it play out, but that will be a big change to keep an eye on.
You know, we can grow some stuff under the solar panels. We're doing that here at Iowa State.
Yes.
They're growing broccoli and strawberries, and they're just getting started just south of here. That's an interesting demonstration to watch.
That is definitely a great use for land for specific purposes. May not be as viable for row crop farming, but I'm glad to see at least we're figuring out some land use for agriculture that can coexist with solar as well.
Well, let's finish with long-term issues such as climate change, technological advancements in agriculture, or shifts in land use policy. How will that affect the trajectory of farmland values in Iowa?
So you mentioned three things. I'll take them one by one. Climate change. So climate change is not something that we can detect on a day-to-day or a year-to-year basis. It's happening. It's a gradual change that we're going through. And since it's a gradual change, its mitigation, the strategies that people are doing to deal with it one way or the other are also sort of gradual. What that will look like 50 years from now, whether we'll have, let's say, more consistent dry years, maybe we resemble Kansas a little bit more in terms of needing irrigation. I don't know how that will play out in the long run. But for now, climate change in the next 5 years, 10 years, we are accommodating our agriculture to it along the way. So for now, it's not really leading to any drastic changes. The other two things you mentioned, technology is definitely something that's changing at a much, much faster pace. There's always been changes in the economy. We went through the Industrial Revolution, then we went through mechanization, automation. But this current decade or a couple of decades for technology, not just in agriculture, generally in the economy, they are definitely much more drastic than anything we've seen before. And there's one thing about ag technology, it's our machinery, how automated it can become, our seed science, soil science, all of those things, how that is progressing. But then I'm also thinking about the technology with all this AI automation and how we can integrate that into farming. I think that will be a drastic change that will potentially lead us to needing fewer farmers, that will potentially lead to more consolidation, bigger farms. That will also perhaps transform the farmer of tomorrow as more of a businessman. That business acumen is probably going to become necessary for surviving in the ag markets of tomorrow. So that's the direction. How soon do we get there is anybody's guess. The technology is changing. We are moving in that direction. But whether we get there in 5 years or 15 or 20 is something that we don't know yet.
Right.
Land use policies. For me, the biggest land use change I may foresee is to do with energy. Anything other than that, I don't foresee anything else competing with our land use in the Midwest. Now, when it comes to other policies related to the land markets, things like who can own land, things like foreign ownership, those are definitely talked about a lot, but foreign ownership is not really a concern for the Midwest. It's a very, very small fraction of land that has foreign interest when it comes to Iowa or our neighboring states in the Midwest as well. And most of that is coming from energy leases. That's not really a policy that is of concern to us. We have been very good at keeping our land within farming and local. So while that is something that's discussed a lot, I don't see that policy affect how things are being done or how we're farming in the near future at all.
Thanks, Dr. Chandio. We know farmers keep a watchful eye on local land sales, but it's good to occasionally zoom out and assess what's happening at the state level and beyond. If you'd like to see more from the most recent ISU Land Value Survey, we've included a link down in the notes for this podcast episode. Next, let's turn our attention to another useful yearly study, the Power of Meat Report, which is released by the Food Industry Association and the Meat Institute. Each year, for the past 20 years, the Power of Meat study has offered insight into Americans' meat purchasing habits. The 2025 edition of the report was released earlier this spring. Spokesman editor Tom Block called up Rick Stein, who is the Vice President of Fresh Foods for the Food Industry Association, to learn what's in the 2025 Power of Meat study and what it means for livestock farmers and others involved in meat production.
Rick, this is the 20th anniversary of the Power of Meat study. Can you give me an overview of how the study is conducted and some of the top-line results from this year's study?
This is, as you said, the 20th anniversary of the meat study. What's interesting is we did this collaboration with the Meat Institute starting 20 years ago. This was a collaboration between FMI and the Meat Institute, and it was an opportunity to help our members and their members understand the total meat category. And so we presented it annually at our meat conference. And what I always find interesting about this study, or what I'm really proud of, is we think of this as a study for the industry, by the industry. And when I say by the industry, we reach out to both meat suppliers and retailers, and we say, hey, what do you want to know? What are you trying to understand from the consumer? So we could go out and ask a bunch of questions, but we may not be answering the questions that they really want to know. So they get to drive the bus, so to speak. They get to say, here's what we want to know from the consumers. The other thing I think is important is the study is really representative of the contiguous 48 states. We get both rural, urban, we get all the ethnicities, all the incomes. So it's truly representative of what's happening. And then when we dive into the deep analysis, we can show differences by region if we wanted to. So we could say, hey, here's what's happening in the Northeast, here's what's happening in the Southwest, things like that. The other thing I'm really proud of, because I'm a former retailer, and I used to say we kind of treated this like a Bible on the desk. When you were in the meat department and this report started coming out, every buyer kind of had it right there on their desk to reference, because as you got into conversations around strategy and tactics, as you were trying to drive meat department sales, you often had these little tabs on the different pages that you were turning to kind of say, hey, this is kind of what the study said, so how are we addressing that? So I think it's been a really well-received report. The only other thing I would add is when I joined FMI, the Power of Meat was already in existence. We took that same concept and started doing the rest of fresh. So now we're doing the power of produce and the power of food service and the power of seafood, which is a real, what do they say? Imitation is the greatest form of flattery. So that's a real kudos to the Power of Meat.
So yeah, you can really dig in and get some great consumer insights. Let's talk a little bit about this year's Power of Meat study. It showed pretty strong meat consumption. And one thing that was interesting to me is that higher prices often prompt consumers to change their buying habits. So why do you think meat sales this year were up despite the rising prices?
Well, Tommy, you're right. 2024, I think it was $104.6 billion in sales. And not only was it up in dollar sales, it was also up in units. Despite the fact that, as you said, consumers were concerned about food prices. There's a couple reasons this happened, Tom. One is we started seeing the behavior of consumers, and they were looking at all kinds of varieties of meat. So, it used to be what we would call the middle meats really drove most of the sales. Now customers are looking for all kinds of different options. Part of that is driven by they're looking for value. Part of that is driven by we have a much more multicultural public, where some of the different cuts that weren't as widely used in the past are more used. Take ground meat, for example. We used to just, think of ground beef. I go into stores now and I see a ground section. And there's ground pork, and there's ground chicken, and there's ground turkey, and there's ground beef, and there's all these options, or even ground bison. So I think that's another example. We also see different package sizes. So if as a consumer, I'm not necessarily having to buy what I call the hernia pack. We see a lot more single households. I'm seeing 1 pound packages, sometimes 0.75 pound packages in ground beef, things like that. I also think what's driving the meat department, and we talk a lot about this at FMI, is this idea of special occasions. I heard a stat from Circana the other day that if you remove the major holidays, right, so you take out Christmas and Thanksgiving and Memorial Day, 4th of July, the average consumer has 70 days of special occasions. That's like a fourth of the year, right? I mean, that's crazy. So when you think of special occasions, your mindset changes. If I'm having a special occasion, I have a tendency to splurge or spend a little bit more than I would in a normal cadence. So it could be Friday night date night. It could be I'm having the girlfriends over, for a luncheon. It could be a celebration of a first communion or a baptism or a wedding or things of that nature. And all these occasions add up, and that's adding fueling to the meat department's resonance, because we know meat has a great penetration. It's like 98% of consumers have bought some type of meat protein. So we know they enjoy it. I think the special occasion really plays into it. Consumers are starting to change the behaviors in which they eat. And there is a focus on protein. We've seen these GLP-1s. GLP-1 is that drug that they originally used to treat diabetes. So it goes under Wegovy, Ozempic, Mounjaro, or some of the brand names. But it's basically an inhibitor that actually decreases your appetite. There's only a small percentage of consumers on the GLP-1s, but it's almost like the 2 degrees of, like, if you're not on it, you know someone who is, or you know someone who knows someone who is. And you're watching how what they eat is influencing their health and well-being. And so you're starting to see they're starting to gravitate into protein and fresh departments more. So I think that's also fueling the meat growth.
And as we look at buying habits, you mentioned a few things, but in the past 5 years, I don't know if we even know what normal is since the pandemic and inflation. So can you just describe maybe, in that 5-year window, how have consumer grocery shopping and buying habits changed over the past few years due to the pandemic and the inflation and all those other things that are going on in the market?
Well, the good news is you've come to the right source, because FMI has been studying U.S. shopper trends for 51 years now. So every year we go out, we look at what consumers are doing, and we report on that. And I would say over the past couple of years, we really looked at this notion of what value means to a consumer, because we keep hearing that consumers are looking for value. This started happening pre-pandemic and just magnified itself when all the restaurants were closed and we had to eat at home. Consumers are continuing to look for value. Then inflation hit and value became even more important. But what does value mean? You and I would probably say, if we go back in the day, Tom, value was really about price, right? Lower the price, better the value. That's not what consumers are telling us now. Consumers are talking about convenience. They're talking about experience. They're talking about, is it relevant? And they're even talking more and more about quality. So this definition of value has changed, and how consumers are perceiving that. And where consumers are finding value, they're willing to spend more. Our latest trend reports dig deeper into that notion of eating well and the purchase drivers that encourage shoppers to spend a little bit more. So, we looked at health and making investments both in short and long-term health, how that's impacting consumers. We looked at entertainment. I've mentioned before these special occasions, that's the most flexible category, but shoppers are willing to reward themselves for hard work and do things in terms of entertainment. There's a lot more exploration. I mentioned this multicultural society. There's a lot of cuisine that consumers are looking for inspiration, adding excitement. And then always convenience underlies all of that. We're a busy society and we're looking at convenience. So I think these purchase drivers are really important for both the food retailers and suppliers to consider when they're thinking about the shoppers. And as they think about how shoppers are concerned about food prices and the way they seek to meet their food budgets, I think we have to think beyond just the price, but think of this total value equation. And when it comes to the meat department, the food retailers who continue to cater to expanded definition of value and consider these drivers are going to win.
You talked about some multicultural differences in buying patterns. How about, are there any notable differences in the buying patterns across generations of consumers, ranging from Gen Z, millennials, boomers? What do you find in those aspects?
Yeah, like I said, when we do this report, we're able to dissect it. I'll start off with, like I said earlier, almost 97% of households have purchased meat or poultry in 2024, with an average of about 98.2%. The generational differences, the differences in dollar contribution lie in how they bought meat. For example, boomers bought meat and poultry 59 times in 2024 versus an average of 42 for Gen Z. So you're seeing more frequency on the boomers, a little less frequency on Gen Z. So that's one difference. Boomers are spending a little bit more on meat. They average $15.78 per purchase, whereas Gen Z only averaged $15.05. Millennials spent more per trip, $17, but they shopped a little less often, only 49 times versus the boomers at 59. But when we look at millennials, they're really looking for that time-seeking convenience options. Gen X, which is the smallest generation, was the biggest contributor to the meat sales in 2024, which kind of makes sense because if you think of that Gen X, they have older children, bigger appetites, bigger families, and they were at 32% of the dollars. And Gen X averaged 56 trips. The last stat I would share is that Gen Z's share of total spending was less than 3% in 2024.
And one of the things about meat that our farmers are very prominent about is the nutritional benefits. It's a nutritional powerhouse. It has all kinds of vitamins and minerals. So how do the nutritional benefits of meat influence shoppers' purchasing decisions? Do you see fluctuations in meat sales as a result of protein-focused diet trends, for example?
Great question, Tom. When I think of health and well-being, our studies show that 6 out of 10 consumers agree that they put effort into making healthy and nutritious food choices. That's a big number. And when 60% of your consumers are doing that, meat is part of a healthy diet. 74% of the shoppers agree that meat and poultry belong in a healthy, balanced lifestyle. In addition, 74% of the consumers think of meat as an overall healthy choice. That's phenomenal. That's great news. That almost 3/4 of the public see it as a healthy choice. And 73% agree it's an all-around nutrient powerhouse. The emphasis on protein, more than half, 54% of the consumers say they are getting enough protein in their daily diet. And shoppers most commonly associate protein with meat as well as eggs, fish, milk, and cheese. Still, there's an opportunity to educate shoppers more about specific protein and nutritional benefits.
And Rick, our members are those farmers who are out there every day working to raise this meat on the consumer's plate. How does the work that those farmers do every day to raise high quality meat help boost meat sales? What did your study find in terms of how those consumers view farmers and the way animals are raised?
U.S. farmers are obviously essential to the meat department. In fact, 53% of the shoppers said they would buy more meat and poultry from the meat department if they could confirm the farmers treated animals with care and compassion. So animal welfare is in their mindset. Half of the U.S. meat shoppers think that animals are raised in a humane way in our country. At the same time, 47% of the shoppers say that animal welfare impacts their purchase somewhat or greatly. And then I think of transparency, continued transparency and education in the areas of responsible raising and sourcing as a win for all consumers. It reinforced trust in that currently take place, and it has a positive perception among the consumers who simply don't know or don't believe the industry's focus on humane and responsible production. The other thing I think about with the farmers, I think they've done a tremendous job over the decades of being responsible. Often the meat department gets some of these attacks on environmental issues. Well, we've seen since 1970, a 32% increase the weight of the cow, right? Which means herd count is down. you can produce as much meat with a smaller herd count. As you reduce the herd count, it has a very positive effect on the environment and things like that. And this is meaningful to the consumers. They want to know that farmers are being good stewards of the land and good stewards to the animals. So I think they play a really critical role.
Yeah, that sustainability conversation is one that we have a lot, and you're right, exactly right about same amount of meat, far fewer resources. So I appreciate you pointing that out. And as you mentioned, consumers have more choices than ever, not only at the meat counter itself, but throughout the grocery store as a retail veteran yourself. Do you think the strong consumer demand for real meat will continue for the foreseeable future, or what does your crystal ball look like?
I do believe shoppers will continue to seek out meat, and there's a lot of trends that are driving that, including, I mentioned, value. That's meat options that fit within the shopper's expanded definition of value. I think of the value factor, the factors of health, convenience, entertainment, exploration, all play into that meat department's offerings. I also think protein trends. We continue to see protein trend among Americans. If you and I walk through a grocery store, we're going to see that name protein all up and down all those aisles. We're going to see protein bars, but no one has the amount of protein. We absorb protein better when we eat it through animal protein. So I think the protein trend is going to work to us as well. But I think we have to continue to educate shoppers. I think we need to continue as food retailers and suppliers to think of how do we explain the nutritional benefits, explain the animal welfare, explain all the aspects of the meat department and its benefits if we want that to continue to be strong. So I'm very optimistic and bullish on how the meat will progress, but I'm also saying that comes with due diligence. We have to do our job to help drive that and continue to be an ally to our consumers as they look for those choices.
Well, Rick, this has been a fascinating conversation. Appreciate your insights, and as well as the work that you and the Food Industry Association does to promote meat for our members.
Sounds great, Tom. We enjoy it. It's a passion of ours.
Thanks, Rick. Faced with ever-growing options at the grocery store, today's consumers, young and old, continue to see value in the meat that comes from our farms. That's something you've got to feel encouraged by if you're an Iowa livestock farmer. I think it's also important to pay attention to the recommendation Rick offered us about continuing to inform today's consumers, helping them understand that meat is packed with nutrition and it comes from farms where families are prioritizing animal care and environmental protection. Those three priorities, nutrition, sustainability, and animal care, have been the pillars of Iowa Farm Bureau's Real Farmers, Real Food, Real Meat initiative for the past few years, and they'll remain important messages as farmers continue to build bridges with today's consumers. To learn more about the 2025 Power of Meat study and Iowa Farm Bureau's Real Farmers, Real Food, Real Meat initiative, check out the links down in the podcast notes. That's all for this edition of the Spokesman Speaks podcast. We hope you enjoyed it and that you'll join us for our next episode on June 23rd. Thank you for doing the work that inspires everything we do here at the Iowa Farm Bureau, and thanks for listening to the Spokesman Speaks.
Thank you for listening to the Spokesman Speaks, a podcast by Iowa Farm Bureau. Check out more podcast episodes at iowafarmbureau.com/podcast. You can also find and subscribe to the Spokesman Speaks podcast in the Apple Podcasts app, Google Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, and other popular podcast apps. We appreciate your ratings and reviews, and we welcome you to email us your feedback at podcast@ifbf.org.